Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. Drake and I are here covering week 4 of the NFL action, and about a quarter way through the season, a lot is happening so far. Obviously a little too early on in the season to really get a clear idea of what the playoff picture is going to be, but kind of in that spot where we're looking a little bit ahead, seeing where all the teams sit thus far into the season. So looking at this last week of games, Drake and I wanted to start with the Steelers at the Texans. Obviously this one went huge in favor of the Texans. What are your takeaways here, Drake?
I think a lot of it is just showing I feel like the last few weeks kind of, if you were to sum up what we've been talking about, coaching and organizational support is huge for young players especially. And I think that's what we're seeing with CJ Stroud, bringing in DeMeco Ryan, a young head coach who's passionate about a team he even played for. CJ Stroud, obviously, I think a lot of us kind of had kind of the similar sentiment of no one really knew who the home run hit was going to be for the quarterbacks. And we still don't, it's still very early, but CJ Stroud pretty much unanimously was seen as having the highest floor. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. He's very quick and decisive. It's something we're seeing with a lot of the quarterbacks in this class. Anthony Richardson, too. Both of those guys are very decisive. And Young has obviously had a little more struggles, but I put most of that blame onto Carolina more so than anything. But back to Stroud, I just think they did perfect to try and surround him with talent early. So whereas a lot of teams, try to get, the talent after they get their quarterback so they can kind of see what they want, they went out and got him some really solid players. They picked up Dalton Schultz in free agency. I've been big on Nico Collins since he came into the league. I just kind of was waiting for him to break out. I didn't think the Texans had anyone. Now, I didn't think he was going to be this good, but still. And then you look at a guy like Tank Dell, who's worked some great chemistry. John Mechie, obviously sitting out last year due to cancer, but now he's back. Robert Woods, Damian Pierce. You just have a really solid young core around your quarterback, and I think it's helping CJ because, again, where his accuracy might not be there entirely yet, his decision-making and his chemistry is already building. So wins and losses come and go at this phase, but what's more important is watching him develop, and I think we're seeing that. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of things with Pittsburgh, we're seeing the reverse effect on Kenny Pickett. He seems to have regressed after a very impressive preseason. Despite having solid weapons at his disposal, the offensive play calling is mind-bogglingly inefficient. Najee Harris is struggling to get going. They have a new young running back, Jalen Warren, who they barely are getting going. The young, dynamic Calvin Austin, who had that insane touchdown on primetime last week against the Browns. You're looking at a team who's setting up their young player for success versus one whose coaching is kind of limiting, I feel like, what they have. You have guys like George Pickens, Najee Harris, Allen Robinson. I really like Freiermuth, and you're not scoring points very often. You scored 6 points against the Texans team, who is projected to maybe be a top 5 pick again this year. So I think we're just seeing Steelers. We're seeing complacency and sort of that, long regimed coach. Mike Tomlin's been there for a long time, so it's similar to what I think is happening in New England right now. With the Patriots, but I think you're seeing the opposite and why it is just so refreshing to have a new start, even if it's, this sort of, again, the Texans O-line still isn't great. The defense still has some holes, but again, getting your young quarterback in a position to succeed is the most important thing in today's NFL, and we're seeing kind of the two sides of a coin right now with these two teams is what I think the matchup really showed me.
Absolutely. I'll touch on the Texans real quickly, and then I want to give you a take about the Steelers and the organization as a whole. But I think you did a great job of kind of outlining what has led to CJ having so much success so early on in the NFL. And obviously, as rookie seasons go, as teams get more tape, we might see a little bit of a regression as the year goes on. I think right now, by the numbers, he's a top 10 quarterback in the league. I definitely don't think he is one yet, but those 6 touchdowns to 0 INTs, over 1,200 yards with a 100.6 passer rating, super, super impressive for a rookie player, especially with that offensive line that has just a ton of turnover week after week. They're on second and third string guys all across that offensive line. And, after giving up 11 sacks through those first 2 weeks, they gave up 0 over the last 2. And I think that is a huge part in contributing to, Stroud's ability to just stay calm in the pocket and get the ball out. Like you said, he's not the most accurate, but when he has that extra time, he's able to get the ball out to guys like Nico Collins. Only 7 receptions for a huge amount of yardage and 2 touchdowns. So great chemistry building there already. And I just think from an organizational standpoint, like you're saying, bringing in the young head coach that can really build a connection with a first-year quarterback, I think it's just, laying down the roots for building a winning culture. Obviously, it might have been more beneficial for the Texans to just be horrible again all year, try to get one of those top 3, top 5 draft picks. But I think that the organization committing to try and win every single week, it's a big deal that matters down the line. Then when we look at the Steelers side of the ball here, I think the Steelers, and my take here is I think there's a little bit of that legacy and commitment to loyalty that is now starting to kind of, we're seeing the unsuccessful side or the downsides of that, right? Obviously, the Steelers are one of the most legacy franchises in the NFL, but I would equate it to very much what we see with Golden State in the NBA, whereas your loyalty can be such a great asset to when you want to bring people into that building and people and just, the team culture, the commitment to the team. But at the same time, I think it can also be your downfall, I think you mentioned it with the offensive play calling, but Matt Canada's obviously not getting it done right now. And there's just a lack of creativity. I think there's an old school mentality there where things were always done a certain way and they just don't want to adjust. And I don't really want to put it on the shoulders of Tomlin. I'm really high on Tomlin. I think he's a top 10 coach in the NFL. But again, he could also be part of that problem with just not wanting to see things a different way. Obviously, when you have the success, as long as you had it with Ben Roethlisberger, and even before that era, it's hard for you to want to have turnover in that building. But I think loyalty to some extent can be your downfall when there are so many other teams that are actively trying new things week in and week out, and just that aggressive mindset of like doing everything that it takes to win. I think loyalty can sometimes be a shortcoming.
No, I completely agree. I think, it just looks stale, and what they're doing, it's confusing to me because they have so many unique talents. They have the Minkah Fitzpatrick, who I think is the best safety in football, and they really aren't supporting any of I feel like they aren't putting a lot of their best players in a position to succeed. George Pickens, obviously a freak talent. Allen Robinson, obviously his career has been a little storied, as he was so good and he's kind of trailed off, but still they have so much upside and they just aren't tapping into any of it. And I do agree. I think a lot of that does kind of lie on, loyalty, misplaced loyalty, in terms of, again, at the end of the day, you still have a job to do and your job is to win. And so, I get not wanting to just be cutthroat and cutting people all the time, but you don't have to do that to still have a good roster. But, certain things are going to work, certain things aren't. If something's not working, there's no point in hanging on just for the sake of hanging on.
Absolutely. And every Steelers season to me over the last couple has felt very much the same, where we kind of know they're not a true contender going into the year. I think, they had that slight aberration when they started 11-0 a couple years back. But every year since then, it seems to feel like they get off to a slow start. They have a couple wins or a couple losses, early on in the season where you're like, that's a game you had to win if you're going to make it into the playoffs. And somehow they turn it around at the season halfway point and always find a way to, float at about 500 or above. And, while we can applaud Tomlin for never having a season below 500, I also think there's something to be said on the opposite side of that spectrum where you've got to do something to get off to a better start. And it's all about expectations, right? When our expectations are lowered over the course of the Steelers season, when they sneak into the playoffs, all of a sudden it's a success. But going into this season, I personally thought for a team that was at 500 last year, getting their best defensive player back and your quarterback becomes a second year player, I think you've got to be better. And we haven't seen a better version of the Steelers this year.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, again, you kind of nailed it with the whole concept of this, hanging on just for the sake of hanging on rather than trying to win is kind of how they've been the last few years. And then with that, I think we will carry over into our second game, the primetime game that the whole world watched, as we saw. The Chiefs at Jets. Obviously, this game was a rarity as it was the first time Mahomes has ever had someone throw for more touchdowns, less interceptions, more yards, and a higher quarterback rating. So, Wilson, what were kind of your thoughts about this game, a game in which I feel like has been talked about a lot for a bevy of reasons?
Yeah, and I think you're right there. I mean, the Chiefs are now almost seemingly bigger than football with this whole Travis Kelce Taylor Swift storyline. 27 million viewers, the most since the Super Bowl. Obviously an incredible feat, and I think a lot of that, specter kind of takes away from the game that was actually played on the field at times. If we just start with the quarterbacks here, obviously an impressive outing from Zach Wilson. When you outplay a guy like Patrick Mahomes, I think, especially for a guy who his starting job was kind of in question there in New York, we have to applaud him. At the same time, I do think it can be a slight indictment for a guy whose offense was only able to score 20 points. A lot of people heralded as maybe the best game of his NFL career. I think there's kind of a backhanded compliment in that sentence. But, that being said, I think these are two pretty good defenses. And while I think people were high on the Jets defense going into the year, I personally didn't think much of the Chiefs, but seeing it play out over the last couple of games, they've only allowed 5 offensive touchdowns through 4 games. And I think that's a secondary, as just an entire backfield that has, everyone's a little bit older. They were pretty young last year with a lot of rookie and second year players. I think Trent McDuffie has played really well for them. Pro Football Focus had him rated as the number 1 corner. I don't necessarily think that's a little bit of a stretch, but I do think, again, that was a game that was kind of highlighted by the defensive play. I thought both teams played well, and there were a couple bad calls on both sides. I think when the Chiefs get a lot of those bad calls in the second half, that can oftentimes become part of the storyline. And I'm not really big on criticizing the refs dictating the direction that the game goes. I think you should just play it out how it's played on the field. But I do think that has to become part of the story, especially when it's, that's the last drive. The Chiefs hadn't been able to move the ball, and all of a sudden they essentially take the ball 70 yards down the field to run out the clock. So I think a lot of interesting storylines in there. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone expected the Jets to take that away, but a lackluster win for the Chiefs for sure.
Yeah, I just think, I agree with the sentiment of, I don't think we should ever necessarily blame refs, but I just think what fans are so, irked about is one, it does seem like teams like the Cowboys and Chiefs get more calls, but I think a lot of that is also we watch them more than most other teams. They're on primetime every week, so we're seeing these penalties be called. So I think that's part of it. So I will give both the teams kind of a pass for that, but also the NFL is not stupid. If the Chiefs and Cowboys are winning, they're doing good too. So do I think sometimes there's these ticky-tacky things, the refs just let it go if it's for the Chiefs or Cowboys? I definitely think there's some merit to there. And again, I think what pissed people off so much about the hold on Mahomes' insane scramble was, one, it was Juwan Taylor, who's now been benched twice this year due to penalties. A dude who's been being called that much, has a target on his back, doesn't get called for an egregious hold, where the players like the Jets defender, who was it? Oh, Jermaine Johnson was literally like shrugging, like he was like, how can I do anything through this? And then obviously, again, I agree. The hold on Sauce Gardner, I think there's an argument for it. I think there's an argument for not being a hold. But to call it that late after the interception's been thrown, it feels like, we equated it in the playoffs last year. We were talking about the annoying fouls where they'll shoot the ball and then it'll miss and then the refs call it. That's what that felt like to me. It felt like that was going to be a penalty if it needed to be one. And as we talked about in the NBA, I don't think that should ever be the case with penalties.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think you did a good job of kind of outlining why the ref storyline seems to come out more with the Chiefs and teams like the Cowboys. And you're right, it is because there is the spotlight. And I also just think circumstantially, oftentimes it just feels like those are the calls that are swinging the game in one direction or another, usually in favor of the teams aforementioned. And I think just as a casual viewer of football or a diehard fan, either way, I think it's just frustrating to see the game come down to those calls when those calls aren't being made for 80-90% of the rest of the game. And again, not an indictment on the refs. I understand it's an incredibly hard task to do it out there. Heat of the pressure, they understand as the game gets tighter, more people are tuning in. There's more eyeballs on the field. But, just again, we talked about it a lot at length with, those conference title matchups as well as the Super Bowl last year. Just a frustrating sight to see games that are so good come down to the end and wind up like that.
No, I agree. And just kind of my last thing is, you were saying Zach Wilson's best game only scored 20 points, but what I don't really want to undersell is I was very impressed with Zach Wilson this game. It finally seemed like the coaching staff put him in a position to succeed, and he was making the most of it. And what I want to say is just like, I know you're like, it was a little backhanded, but again, you're playing one of the best secondaries in the league. In my opinion, this Chiefs secondary, they made Trevor Lawrence. Look what Trevor Lawrence did a week ago, the golden boy of the NFL. Everyone loves to talk about how great he is, but he looked lost against that secondary. That Zach Wilson comfortably was going through his reads, making quick decisions. I mean, when you have Mike Edwards, L'Jarius Sneed, Trent McDuffie, Willie Gay, Chris Jones up the middle, and not a great O-line. And Zach Wilson delivered, though, time and time again. I think, honestly, I don't think it should be understated how this could be the game, him finally taking that next step. If you're able to have a game this good, and again, it was like you said, it was an okay game, but if you're able to have a game this solid against a great defense, when your defense on its own is great, the Jets could stay in the playoff hunt long enough for Rodgers to come back. He's already walking without a boot. For Achilles procedures, it's pretty common for about 6 weeks after to be in a boot. He's already in shoes. So, Zach Wilson taking this step to me might be the Jets staying in the playoff hunt. Seriously, I think that's why I think this game shouldn't be undersold. Again, the stats weren't all that impressive, but I just think what Zach Wilson did outplaying one of the best in the league right now and a team that's one of the best coach teams in the league. They're trying to exploit his weaknesses, but he didn't let them. I think this game, to me, this was the first game where I was like, I was almost proud of Zach Wilson because it's like he finally is shedding that mantra, right? He had a great press conference interview afterwards. He's like, look, I let him down. I only scored 20. That shows, again, it's like what I was talking about with Baker and why I root for him so hard. Seeing his maturing and really coming into his own. I like when players do that. So if this is the start of Zach Wilson's, I'm all for it. I think he played a great game, and I really think this is what we should still be talking about the game. Not Taylor Swift, not the refereeing, none of that. I think we should be talking about Zach Wilson.
And real quickly, before we move on to the next matchup, I'm right there with you. For me personally, it's been hard not to root for Zach, especially this year. I think we really saw him just within the span of really just 12 months mature a bunch. There was a quote last year after the offense only scored 3 points. And, he was basically asked if, he let the defense down. And he said, no, just straight up, no, I don't believe that I did that. And, this year, immediately after the game, he was taking accountability, saying that the fumble on that snap cost them the game. And while that may be true, you're right. It undersells an incredible performance underneath the circumstances, right? Down 17-0 to the Chiefs. A lot of teams this year have just been rolling over the moment they're down 3 scores. We've seen a lot of blowouts, especially when the offenses aren't able to get anything going. And for a guy who, again, it was in question whether or not he was going to start. People thought that the backup Tim Boyle might come in. People were speculating that he might come into that game, and for Zach to kind of rally, really get the offense behind him. And, I'd also credit Robert Saleh a bit there. Excuse me. He's been on Zach's bandwagon ever since, the first day of this year, first day of camp. He's been saying that, the future, a lot of it's going to be about Zach. And there had been a lot of talk about the dysfunction within that locker room. I think, again, underneath all of that pressure, Zach Wilson really showed out and really performed well against the best quarterback in the NFL. So that was really cool to see.
No, I agree.
I think with that, then we'll turn over to our third matchup. We have the Patriots out the Cowboys. Obviously, this one got away from the Patriots a lot quicker than a lot of people might have expected going into this marquee matchup. A lot of people were calling it, the fight for America's team. The Cowboys defense did what Cowboys defense do, and we've known the Patriots offensive limitations for quite some time now. Any major takeaways from this one for you, Drake?
So I'll save my Patriots takeaways for our next segment where we're going to talk a little bit more exclusively about them. But for my Cowboys take, I really think they are just slowly started becoming what the Bills have been the last few years for the NFC, where if they're going to blow someone out, they're going to kill you. But in close games, they can't bear it. And it's one of the reasons why, again, look at the games: 40-0 against the Giants, 30-10 against the Jets, 38-3 against New England. I don't think any of those teams by any stretch are bad, but if they can kill you, they are. Arizona, on the other hand, won 28-16. It's that sort of when it rains, it pours mentalities. The Bills, obviously, we remember a few years ago when they killed the Patriots in the playoffs. They scored 40 points in the playoffs just to not win in the Super Bowl, not even to make the Super Bowl, because again, it's that sort of close games. The Cowboys are going to expose their own weaknesses. It's kind of what Shanahan's done for years now. In a close game, Shanahan outcoaches himself. In a close game, Josh Allen outplays himself. I think we're starting to see that with the Cowboys now, where they're sort of becoming this team where when it rains, it pours, but if we're in a close game, we're going to screw up. And that's just kind of where I think they are. I think they're a great team. Don't get me wrong. Talent-wise, they might be top 2, 3 in the league, but I just think at the end of the day, when it's going to come to these big close games, if you can't squeak one out against Arizona, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to undersell Arizona. I think they're a lot better than we give them credit for this year. But I think this game against San Fran, if they get blown out, we're going to know exactly why. Because then I could see them the next week in primetime again, turning around and blowing out the Chargers. But again, I could see them, a very real possibility of them scoring 10 points or under this week, and then 40 points the next week.
I think that's a great take. I think the Bills analogy is spot on. It's exactly right. Josh Allen beats, he feels like he has to be Superman sometimes, and he just beats the Bills over themselves. You mentioned it with the coaching with Shanahan. And I think the Cowboys, the odd thing for the Cowboys for me is it's really a team-wide thing. And the games that the Cowboys don't look good, it looks like everything from top down to bottom, right? The defense doesn't look prepared. The players have no idea what the opposite team is running. Dak looks out of sorts with fumbles and interceptions. And it's just an odd thing for a team as a whole to kind of rise to the occasion as well as they do, and then kind of just shoot themselves in the foot at other times. That 3-1 record, I think you did a great job of outlining it. The 3 dominant wins against, pretty good competition, and then just, a subpar, what are you doing, lost to the Cardinals. When I look at the NFC picture and just thinking about true contenders here for a minute, to me, I think there's 4, and 4 might be generous. I think a lot of people want to just say the Eagles, Niners, and Cowboys. Personally, I think I'd put the Seahawks in that room, as well as I think you could make a case for the Lions, although I'm personally not sold there yet. But when I think I look at that room, San Fran is just top tier talent, right? I think the only questions there really is the coaching, and then what is the quarterback play you're going to get when the Niners have to come from behind, and when Purdy's really forced to make throws that he's not comfortable making yet. I think with the Eagles, what we're seeing is, it's a team that's pretty okay at a lot of things, but they've kind of strayed away a little bit from that power run game that took them so far last year. And to me, Philly just doesn't look as dominant as it did last year. And then you've got a team in the Cowboys where, again, as we just outlined, their highs are going to be better than anybody else in the league. With that defense, they really look like it can just take over any game, shut down the opponent's defense. And when that offense gets going, especially with the defensive scores, they're just unstoppable. And then when you look at a team like the Seahawks, after that week 1 loss, the Seahawks have looked pretty good to me. The offense has a lot of weapons, I think more so than people realize. And the defense, akin to the Chiefs, just got a little bit older. A really young defense last year. Players are getting a lot more experience out there. They've got some really nice corners. The defensive line isn't too bad. And when I just consider that, those contenders, Dallas to me, ironically, feels like they're in the worst spot. Because I don't know if I trust Dallas to have 4 good playoff games to, get to and win the Super Bowl. I just think that it's like it seems inevitable to me where they're just going to have that game where they come out flat and they just don't get it done.
No, I agree. And like I said, I mean, I kind of share the sentiment where I just think, again, I don't think the Cowboys are bad by any stretch, but they are the best a team can be without being a true Super Bowl contender in my eyes. And again, this might come to bite me in the butt if they win it this year, but I'm just pretty confident on the fact of as great as this team is, for some reason, it's like you said, those close games, they just seem unprepared for. It's like they walk into every game with the confidence that they're going to win. The second that confidence is shaken, they can't recover.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question of adversity, right? I think a lot of people have asked the Bills that question over the last couple of years. And, to me, I really don't know if I have the answer to it. You would expect that the message in the locker room is the same every week. And, we see a lot of teams have these kind of overlooking the opponent games, right? I think the Chiefs notoriously have that every single year, where early on in the season, they just have a puzzling loss, whether it's the Raiders, the Colts, or someone like that. And to me, like with the Bills and the Cowboys, those games don't necessarily always come against lesser opponents. They just come when the moment seems to get away from them. And it's just odd for, when that's your issue year in and year out, you think that you'd eventually solve it. And I think that's why we have to question whether or not there needs to be a shakeup at the top.
No, I agree. And with that, I think we will go to our B segment. We will be right back, and then we will be talking about the league's struggling offenses. Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. Getting into our second segment here today, there are 3 teams right now who through 4 weeks have not scored 20 points in a game, and that is the Patriots, Saints, and Raiders. Starting off with the Patriots, Wilsons, what are some things you think either need to change or some things that can be done better in terms of the Patriots to try and save this struggling offense?
Yeah, I think looking at the Patriots, there's a number of things that you could point to. Obviously, the post-Brady era in New England has not been pretty, and, a lot of people point to the lack of weapons, overpaying some of those weapons. But to me, I think you've just got to start with the most valuable position on the field, and that's the quarterback position, led by Mac Jones for the Patriots. Personally, I think Mac Jones is another one of those guys who had a super high floor coming out of college, but a lot of scouts knew that there was going to be a limited ceiling, not the greatest arm, and just there wasn't, off the page talent per se when you just looked at the guy in his tape. And it's a weird spot where I almost don't want it to sound like an attack on Mac Jones, but to me, there's never a world where Mac Jones is going to be a top half quarterback in the AFC. And part of that is just the talent in the AFC right now, right? When you've got guys like Burrow, Allen, Mahomes, Jackson, and then you've got the young guys that are up and coming. It's just going to be super hard for Mac Jones to be able to find himself in the upper tier of quarterback play. And when that's the case, I just don't think that's something that they're going to be able to overcome. Obviously, a lot, there's a conversation of whether or not he's just dinking and dunking his way down the field. Obviously, not a lot of throws downfield for him. And again, you can maybe point towards the scheme and the weapons, but in a year where they've now brought back an offensive coordinator, a true offensive coordinator, I just, I haven't seen any improvement from Mac Jones. It's odd ever since that, essentially all run game they played against Buffalo a couple years ago in that horrible weather setting. And Mac Jones really just hasn't been the same player to me. And you can question whether or not there's a mental block, but I think for an organization that is, the lineage as long as it is in New England, I think it just falls on the shoulders of the quarterback. I think the organization eventually will recognize some of the shortcomings. Maybe you might push back on that, but I think these limitations are Mac Jones.
No, I was big on Mac Jones coming out of college, and I still think, again, he could be a good quarterback. I agree with kind of your take of, again, he doesn't have the physical tools, I think, to ever be truly, one of these, Mahomes, Herbert type guys. But, I'm not, you don't have to be in the NFL to win. I still believe that. And so when I'm looking at him, it just kind of seems like at this point, everyone needs a change of scenery. Mac Jones has now kind of gotten this reputation of being a dirty player. He was approached by a teammate in the locker room last year. That clip of him hitting Sauce went viral. I think he needs somewhere, kind of like how we've talked about Baker and Wilson. You know, a lot of guys coming out of college, they just need to grow up. And no offense to New England, I don't think that's a great circumstance to do it because Patriots are very football. It is all football up in Foxborough. It always has been. That's why it worked with Brady, right? Because Brady's weird. I mean, we see the avocado ice cream and stuff. Brady did his own thing, and then when he showed up on Sundays, he did just enough, right? That was what they needed. I think Mac Jones, though, needs someone a little bit more of a mentorship role, you know, an old guy behind him who can really show him the ropes, similar to what Zach Wilson did. Look at how much it seems like Zach Wilson has matured and taken that next step after working behind Rodgers for a year. That's what I think Mac Jones needs. And I think the Patriots, looking at this quarterback class with Penix, Williams, May, I mean, the list goes on and on. There are a lot of good quarterbacks coming out. If I'm them, I'm trying to get rid of Mac Jones early, trying to trade him somewhere. Maybe, again, you know, you have Bailey Zappi who looks okay in his limited snaps. You know, maybe just, I think a change of scenery is what's needed at this point. And I know it might not happen until after this offseason. They might keep Mac and get someone else and do a little quarterback competition. But I agree. I just think at this point, it lies on the quarterback and coach connection or lack thereof in this example, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I don't really have anything to add there. I think with that, we can move over to our second team, that being the New Orleans Saints. And again, it's another offense that has really struggled, kind of puzzling, because on paper, a lot of people like the acquisition of Derek Carr, as well as, you know, Chris Olave having another year in the league. But it's just really an offense that has struggled to move the ball, really generating no yardage downfield and hardly getting any first downs. I think they only had 11 this last week. Where do you want to start with this one?
I think the Saints are sort of what we saw the Colts do for the last 7 years. I was talking to my friend Gabe about this, and I was talking about how, you know, at some point you just have to hit the reset button, and the Saints are trying so hard not to, and I think that's what's screwing them. Because when you look at them, you're right. On paper, a very talented lineup. You have Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed as your top three receivers. That's a very good core. That's top 15 for sure. Then you look at tight ends. You have Juwan Johnson, Foster Moreau, and Jimmy Graham. Again, top 15 unit. The O-line is starting to figure some things out. They have some great talent on there, and guys like Cesar Ruiz, Ryan Rismiak, Eric McCoy, Trevor Penning obviously has a lot of potential. He just needs to tap into it. You sign Derek Carr, right? You trade for him. You think that's going to be kind of the thing to take your team to the next level. You have Alvin Kamara, Tony Jones Jr., Jamal Williams. This roster shouldn't be losing. And one of the best secondaries in the league, if not the best secondary in the league right now, but you just can't score 20 points. And I think a lot of that comes onto, again, I just think they need to find a new identity. You're never going to have another Drew Brees, and it really just feels like they're building a team for Drew Brees again. And I think you have to understand, Drew Brees is a one-of-one talent. Derek Carr is a good quarterback. He's not Drew Brees caliber. Drew Brees is arguably one of the best three quarterbacks of all time. You're not going to compete with him with a guy like Derek Carr. And again, with how loaded this draft is, I'm in the exact same boat. I think you ride out the year with Derek Carr, you try to lose some games, or you trade up. You have so much talent on your roster, you could trade someone and figure out something. But I think similar, but same story, different font. You know, this sort of back to the Steelers, right? Being okay or good for so long never equals being great. And so many teams, though, would rather that for job security, for players and coaches, that they don't want to take this big swing. And I think if you're the Saints at this point, you have to.
You know, I'll be quick here. I've been on that boat for a very long time, and just saying that the Saints, to me, are an organization that has really just continued to try to be in that middle ground, and they refuse to really commit to the direction that they need to go, in my opinion, which is rebuilding parts of that roster and restructuring the way the organization wants to build that offense. You know, the defense has been pretty soft for the last couple of years. And again, I think it is a root of kind of that Drew Brees problem, right? When you have so much consistency at the quarterback position for so long, you're stale for a reason, right? If it's not broke, don't fix it. And now I think coming out of that era, they're struggling to find an identity. I think OC Pete Carmichael has had a little bit of struggles too. The play calling has been suspect at times, and I think that's contributed a lot to the talent on that roster underachieving to some extent. And again, just to me, that strategy of just running that dead money over and over again, I think the team is just kind of in lockstep with every single year they're trying to be a contender when they're never even in the top 10 contender air. And I really think that's just a poor position to be in because, you know, again, the roster, look, going into every single year, you outlined, you know, essentially by every position, it looks great on paper, but they're just never able to bring all the talent together. And I think there are just some organizational roadblocks that are there.
Yeah, and before we go into the Raiders, I want to say look at the three teams we've talked about today on offensive ineptitudes: Steelers, Patriots, and Saints. Drew Brees, Tom Brady, Ben Roethlisberger. All of them kind of are struggling from that same thing of, if something's working with an old QB, you can keep doing it because he's proven. A young guy shouldn't get the luxury of keeping the same offense, or luxury, or also kind of, again, I think it can hurt some of them, especially a guy like Derek Carr, who has been running a pretty modern NFL offense and then goes to the Saints, which is very kind of this old school West Coast. I just think, again, you're seeing, again, like you said, these organizational roadblocks. I think all three of those teams have that issue. I don't think it's one the Raiders have, and now transitioning over to them, the Raiders, again, another team hasn't scored 20 points. They have not had long-standing QB success in recent history. Obviously, they've had some great guys like Rich Gannon in the past, but going on to the now, I will say I think Aiden O'Connell is the most promise I've seen in this team in a long time. If you get sacked 9 times in a game and you still almost win, and again, I'd argue that the interception was more of play calling issues than a player issue. I think the Raiders of these three might have the brightest future, just because if they do trade Devontae Adams, if they do trade Josh Jacobs, if they do trade all these guys, they're going to have a crap load of picks in one of what I think is the deepest NFL draft in years, and they might have quarterback figured out. If you're the Raiders at this point, I think you're the only of the three teams we've listed that truly have a bright future, because no way Josh McDaniels stays. That dude is terrible. So you're facing the inevitability of him being fired. You have some talent at receiver, and for some reason you aren't using it. And I think, again, a lot of that falls on head coach. But with a young talent at QB, your drafts suck. Your ownership's terrible. But again, at the end of the day, if they really hit the reset button, it's going to be hard to miss next year. I really think next year's draft is one we're going to look on in years in the future and be like, it's insane how many talents was in that, how much talent was. So if you're the Raiders, they won't, because they're the Raiders and they always find a way to screw it up. But if you're the Raiders, I think you're in the best position of these three teams, because again, if I'm the Raiders right now, I'm just figuring out, what do I have? What am I keeping going into next year? What am I changing? Who am I going to hire? That's what the Raiders should be thinking about. This year's over for them. I'm sorry. I think when you're in the AFC West, almost every year is immediately over. But because the Chargers are so terrible and the Broncos are too, they are in the race, as crazy as that is, for the AFC West, which is stupid, but it's just the way that freaking division works. But if I'm the Raiders, I'm pretty happy going into next year, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I think I'm right with you there. And I think, it's less of a question of the quarterback play for me here. I think, a couple questionable decisions. I don't think Josh McDaniels is necessarily the guy you want to lead going into the future. And I also think the Jimmy G contract was a bit of an overpay. But in the same sentence, I understand that in a league with very limited top-tier quarterbacks right now, that's really just the paying price you've got to pay for a guy who is just a middle-tier quarterback in Jimmy G. I think here, one of the main questions that has popped into my head, just watching this Raiders offense over the last couple of weeks, and really just league-wide, is the question of this running back situation that we saw unfold kind of over the summer as we got into the season. And Josh Jacobs obviously has not been the player that he was in years prior. Really struggled this year. Some of it can be the designs, I think. But to me, I think it's the contract situation that becomes real interesting here for me with running backs particularly. In a league where Bijan Robinson arguably could be the second best running back in the league right now, immediately coming out of college, I think, the potential of running backs in their position, it's a tough conversation to have within the locker room. Obviously, it's an incredibly important part to the team as a whole. But when you're able to get 7th round guys like Isaiah Pacheco giving you 70% production of guys that you're having to pay $13-14 million, I think it's a real tough position to kind of run the line of recognizing the value of those players on the roster. We're seeing it in Detroit right now. They spent that 1st round draft pick on Jahmyr Gibbs, but they're starting David Montgomery, and Montgomery's production has been fantastic. And it's kind of this philosophy of, if you have a stable of running backs, understanding that it's a high risk, high injury position, just rotating through guys, trying to limit the snaps, and just kind of, putting guys in where you need them at the time. It's really just kind of a disposable position. And I think it's a tough conversation to have, but at the same time, I think it's one of the most important positions in football right now. Look at the Giants, right? No Saquon, and the offense has looked absolutely horrific.
No, I agree. I think, that's a good take, and it is unfortunate. But yeah, the bell cow era is just over. I think Derrick Henry will probably be, when we look back in years future, I think maybe one day we'll get back to it. But I think the bell cow era will be ended with Derrick Henry, as crazy as that is. And again, one of the best, I think, running backs ever. Just joined the 8,080 club recently. Really just a remarkable talent. But again, then you're seeing, as soon as he gets injured or whatever, so much of your reliance built onto one player, then your issues start to be exposed. Ryan Tannehill is borderline a high school QB with how he looks. And as soon as Derrick Henry's not just bulldozing like he did this week, your team struggles. So, and again, a good team would be able to supplement that, but it's just hard for some reason when they're paying them. I think I'll be honest, I think a lot of it's lazy management more than anything. Because if you can pay, not good quarterbacks like Jimmy Garoppolo 40 a year and you can win like San Fran did, I truly believe that there's absolutely no excuse to say you can't pay a running back 15, 16 a year. But again, that's just not the modern NFL philosophy, and I understand that. And running back by committee, ever since I feel like the Eagles doing it in the Super Bowl a few years ago with Corey Clement and Jay Ajayi, Jordan Howard, I think that kind of changed the landscape, because with a bunch of solid backs, no stud, they were able to take it to a Super Bowl and dominate. So I think even with the backup QB, so I think it just kind of shows that, again, like you said, a stable or this committee is just as valuable as one player, and it's about the same price. But, when your bell cow gets injured, you're kind of screwed. If your committee gets injured, you can just try and find a replacement. It's sort of like the Moneyball era of baseball, buying stats over, talent or production. That kind of philosophy of, we don't need, someone who's going to hit 40 home runs. We just need an equivalent. I think that's what kind of committee's done. Become the equivalent of a superstar with way less liability for injury.
Absolutely. And, to me, it's interesting, just real quickly to end off here, the quarterback and running back positions are kind of at an indirect relationship here, right? Where, QBs are so limited in the league right now, where, again, you're paying guys like Jimmy G and Daniel Jones insane amounts of money just because you want to have survivable play at the quarterback position. Whereas with running backs, if you can get a 6th or 7th draft pick, pick a running back in one of those positions, they can take 50-60% of your snaps, and you're going to get essentially equal the production as if you were paying a guy $16 million, right? Just depending on the structure of your team. And so it's just a tough place to be.
Yeah, no, I agree. And with that, we will throw to our last segment, and we are going to be going over our picks for the season so far and how it's looked.
Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. This is our Season 3, Episode 4 episode, and we are going to be talking about our quarter season outlook thus far into the season. Before the season, Drake and I did some preseason picks on all of the awards, as well as kind of the playoff picture and what we were expecting to see. So we kind of wanted to check in and see where those picks are looking so far. So we wanted to start with Coach of the Year. Drake, I had taken Pete Carroll. How's your pick looking so far?
I took Mike McCarthy for the Cowboys, and again, it looks as good as the Cowboys are, which is great against bad teams or not even necessarily bad teams. Again, we talked about it earlier, so I won't rehash too much, but again, if you're scoring 40 points a game when you're winning, if they can squeak a 13-3 record, he could get it. And I know the Seahawks have been off a little bit more to a struggle, I think, due to O-line play, as well as, having some of the players they thought were going to contribute more. Not obviously, Witherspoon finally had his kind of breakout game, still waiting for Jackson Smith and Jigba, as well as kind of seeing Tyler Lockett. Again, he's getting old. It's inevitable. So I think they really need JSN to step up, but I think both those picks are still valid. I just think, there are now a few teams that might have jumped ahead. I think the Texans obviously are going to be one. I think DeMeco Ryan, right? They always love to give a first-year head coach the award, so I think he might get it if the Texans keep playing like they are.
Absolutely, and with all of these awards, they truly are a narrative award to some extent, right? Obviously, it's not just the most impressive resume, because if that were the case, might have a guy like Andy Reid just win it every year, depending on the Chiefs' record. Yeah. With that, we'll move over to Offensive Player of the Year. I had taken Justin Jefferson, and you had taken Christian McCaffrey. Obviously, your pick is looking pretty nice right now.
I mean, I'd say, though, both of ours. Justin Jefferson is still playing like the best receiver in football, and this year he's trying to break through the moniker of, these number one receivers usually struggle to find the end zone. It's kind of this thing we saw with a lot of guys outside of pretty much Calvin Johnson, and that's just because the dude was 19 feet tall. I think it's kind of unfair to put him in that category, but Jefferson with a 2-touchdown day in their first win of the season. Again, if the Vikings start stringing together wins, I had Kirk for MVP. Kirk and Jefferson's chemistry has not been better. They are really just wheeling and dealing. Barring an injury, I think that's valid, and kind of same thing with Christian McCaffrey. Having a 4-touchdown day, 3 in the first half. I think, again, if San Fran keeps cooking, I think both our picks are going to be valid until the end.
Yeah, not to open the MVP conversation, but your pick, Christian McCaffrey, I think he could very well be in the conversation for MVP, especially aided by the fact that I don't necessarily think his quarterback is an MVP candidate. And I think when, C-Mac's really been the hub of that offense, and that offense has looked unstoppable, I think that adds a couple of credibility points. So I think, C-Mac to me would be the favorite right now, but I also think he should have a name in the hat for the MVP.
Yeah.
Moving over to defensive player of the year, then I had taken Micah Parsons. You had talked a lot about how you just think it has to be an edge at this point to win the award. Just, the kind of spotlight that position gets, as well as the pressure they're able to, how much they're able to affect the quarterback play, which, is the most important on the opposite side of the ball. How do you feel about the picks here?
I kind of think, again, obviously quarter of the season, but I feel like both of our picks are faring pretty well again for this category. And again, I know we're picking big name players, but still, and again, I really liked them after TJ Watt got neutralized by backup offensive linemen. Again, I've been saying it for years. I don't think TJ is nearly as good. If his brother wasn't JJ Watt, I don't think we talk about him nearly as much. But regardless of whatever I think, Micah Parsons getting beat up a little bit, that does concern me for your pick. But again, that's really the only thing. And with how well he's been playing, even if he just, again, has a game or two where he's a little slow in production, I could see him winning. Same thing with Aiden Hutchinson. If the Lions sneak into the playoffs as a high seed, and he's been playing pretty dominant football as far as an edge rusher goes, and on a D-line with not a ton of other superstars like Micah Parsons and TJ both benefit from, I think Aiden definitely has the advantage of being the best on his line. And while Micah and TJ do too, I think the talent threshold's just a little bit higher on their teams as a whole. So I think it helps both of them, while we're seeing Aiden really just him and Micah, I think especially, they're just having their way right now, even through the double teams. Both of them are just playing phenomenal football.
Absolutely, and Hutchinson has been great making flash plays when the moment is kind of called for it. I think the Lions defense has been incredible down the stretch of a lot of these games. The Packers were kind of on the edge of completing a somewhat comeback in a tight game last week. And Hutchinson was able to make some huge plays down the stretch, really shutting down the Packers' ability to, sustain continued drives down the field. So I think just the flash plays and the narrative are going to be on his side as well. Finally, then, Drake and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the playoff picture. Obviously, we had made some picks for the Super Bowl. I kind of wanted just to start with teams, obviously the divisions are tight early on. Basically every team is either 3-1, 2-2, or 1-3. So everyone's within 2 games, give or take. But how do you feel about the playoff picture right now? Are any surprises for you or anyone that has been a super disappointment?
I think the main one is the Bengals. I think now we're seeing the choice to not put Burrow on IR for the first 4 weeks might have cost them their season. He does not look comfortable. Their O-line has regressed, and he just is getting killed while nursing an injury. I think the Bengals, to me, are the biggest disappointment just because of this sort of sometimes what your player wants isn't necessarily best for the team, and you have to make some tough decisions. And I think because they didn't make the tough decision, I think like even Jamar Chase said early on, they just should have shut him down. And I think it's sad because, now he's getting all this talk about, gets the biggest contract ever, doesn't play good. And it's like, this is on everyone. It's not just on him. You lose your 2 starting safeties, Jesse Bates still being a great player, Von Bell still being a great player. You lose both of them, and then you're playing your quarterback injured. It's just not a winning formula. I'm still confused by the decision, and it's really disappointing for me. Meanwhile, the Ravens, I think, kind of have surprised me even more. Despite that gross loss to the Colts, even against this Browns defense, which I heralded as one of the best in the league last week, I know they had a backup quarterback in, but Lamar is really finding sort of comfort in this offense, this new offense. Even though, again, like you said, he's struggling against the blitz hard. When he's getting pressured, he's struggling a lot right now. But we saw that minimized this week. And I think after that Colts loss, he might have, taken a step and been like, look, I don't care what I'm going to do, but I'm going to be better against the blitz. And he really was. So I think the Ravens, I feel like we are not talking about them nearly enough, and it might be because of that loss to the Colts that kind of neutralized everything. But to embarrass a Browns defense, which might be one of the more talented units in the league, I think is not being talked about nearly enough this week.
Yeah, I think both of those there are great picks. To continue on to what you're saying about the Bengals, it's a kind of a situation where the organization has to protect the player from himself. Burrow obviously is going to want to play, but right now, I truly believe he's giving them a top 5 worst quarterback play in the league right now, which is just so disappointing to say for a guy who, when healthy, is definitely a top 5 quarterback. To really fall to the opposite side of that spectrum, which is unfortunate, and it's just 100% because of the health. I don't doubt that at all. And then looking at the Ravens side of things, I think it's real interesting when we talk about true contenders in the AFC. people are quick to point to the Chiefs, the Bills, and a lot of people have anointed the Dolphins. And, as a guy that picked the Dolphins to make the AFC title game, I'm okay with that. But at the same time, I think the Ravens have to be in that conversation. If they're going to be able to get true dual threat play out of their quarterback in Lamar, the defense looks good as ever, and Harbaugh's, one of the best coaches, not just in that conference, but in the entire NFL. So you've got to like the Ravens. I would add just one surprise in for us, and I think this is one that most people probably didn't see coming going into the year, but the Buccaneers have really solidified good positioning in that division that has been overachieving through the first couple of weeks of the season, and that's kind of a trend that I do expect to reverse as the season goes on. But yeah, I think, there's a lot to love with the Buccaneers. Obviously, we talked a lot about the infrastructure of that team and just Baker coming in with a new mindset, new mentality. They've looked great, and, I think everyone had expected a regression to happen. They had, I would call it more of a hiccup against the Eagles, because otherwise the Buccaneers look like they're rolling.
Yeah, I was going to highlight them in a later episode, so I didn't want to touch too much on them today, but I do think they kind of remind me of the Giants last year. Now is where they don't have a new head coach or a lot of new things going on. A quarterback change is sometimes all it takes. Look at the Niners and Brock Purdy. As soon as he's come in, they've looked like a completely different team, despite having Jimmy Garoppolo. So sometimes all it takes is a quarterback coming in. And again, I'm not saying, what Brady did wasn't impressive, but again, Brady was like we were talking about, his old ways. When Brady first went to the Buccaneers, they struggled to run the offense. So they just implemented Brady's old offense from New England because the fix to him. Now, Baker's in there. They're running what they want to do. They're doing what they want to do. Godwin and Evans are both having great years. Evans obviously wanting a contract. I think if Baker keeps throwing to him, he'll get it. But I think they're a sleeper for kind of, again, that sort of make the wild card, win your first game. And even with $78 million in dead cap due to injuries and retirements of linemen, they still look good. I'm very impressed with this Buccaneers team. I think they might be, when we look at the end of the year, I think they might be the biggest surprise come December.
Good take.
And with that, I think we will call our show for today. Please feel free to subscribe, like, and comment down below what you think. We will be back. The third episode of season 3 will come out soon. We've just had some issues with our recording software. But yeah, this one will be up hopefully here soon, and we will see you guys next time. Later.